You there?
I'm here.
You hear me? Okay. All right, let's go for it. You back on?
I'm back on.
Okay, great. Okay, let's start over again. Hello, family. Thank you so much for joining us again for our Sister Reaches Social Justice preacher series for the month of April. Um, I am Elder Victor Hannah, the Faith and Education Outreach Coordinator at Sister Reach. Sister Reach is a grassroots 501c3 reproductive justice organization founded by Cherie Scott in 2011 in Memphis, Tennessee. Sister Reach supports the reproductive autonomy of women and teens of color, poor and rural women, LGBTQIA plus people and their families through the framework of reproductive justice. Sister Reach's mission is to empower our base to lead healthy lives, raise healthy families, and live in a healthy and sustainable, or live in healthy and sustainable communities. This is achieved through working by a four-pronged strategy: education, policy, and advocacy, cultural shift, and harm reduction locally, nationally, as well as internationally. So today we have the pleasure of having with us as our guest, Reverend Dr. Robin Tanner. Dr. Tanner is an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister. She is a lead ministry team at Beacon Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Summit, New Jersey. She has an MDiv from Harvard Divinity School and a Doctor of Ministry from Pacific School of Religion. Um, she is also the president of Summit Interfaith Council and a board member of Community Change. She is also the senior fellow with Salvation and Social Justice. Come on, Sister Reach, please help me welcome our Social Justice Preacher Series guest for April 2024, Reverend Dr. Robin Tanner.
Thank you so much. Beloved, I want to thank the goddess and God of my understanding as love for the existence, the fortitude, the vision of Sister Reach, for 13 years of supporting the reproductive autonomy of women and teens of color, poor and rural women, LGBTQIA plus people and their families through the framework of reproductive justice. I also want to give thanks this evening for the reproductive justice elders and founders, most especially this day, Loretta Ross, Elizabeth Ann Terry, Abel Mabel Thomas, and Dr. Tony M. Bond Leonard. I pray this day as well for a cloak of protection around the founder, Ms. Cherise Scott, Reverend Dr. Salisbury, and yes, Elder Victor Hanna. I am so grateful for the invitation to be with you. And I just want to say a brief word. I'm looking forward to our conversation. I want to begin today with the text of Hosea chapter 4, verse 6. My people are destroyed by a lack of knowledge. My people are destroyed by a lack of knowledge. This is a teaching translated by many modern prophets, found in the words of James Baldwin, who proclaimed that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Or Sister Ella Baker, who taught us to give light and people will find a way. My topic today that brings me to the heart of the matter is something that in my experience as a community organizer, as a pastor, an executive director, is that there's an invisible system, a story that is shaping and directing many of our institutions, including our faith communities. Now, I call this chattel theology, which if you are theologically inclined, doesn't sound like a theology you want anything to do with at all. And you would be right. Chattel theology, a system of theology, of meaning making that at its core dehumanizes and denies the inherent worth of humanity. If white supremacy, beloved, had a theology, it would be chattel theology. Now, I'm guessing most of my gathered congregation in this venue on Facebook are people of progress and hope and inclusion. So why should we worry this evening about chattel theology, especially in our institutions? Isn't that something only of Christian nationalism and white supremacy and presidents who sell Bibles they haven't even read? I wish it were so. Today, there are too many testimonies of chattel theology in the very institutions whose missions proclaim to liberate, and to take us toward progress. I also want to affirm this night that in the long history of theology, in the long history of meaning making, theology ought not be something that is only held by religious leaders, by the ministers, the preachers, the imams, and the rabbis. No, theology has to go public in the times in which we are in. Theology has to be shared by all people. Now, to understand why I come to speak of something as antiquated as theology at all, I need to back up a little bit. Is that okay with you, Elder Hannah, if I back up just a minute?
Absolutely.
When I was a young woman in college navigating life as a lesbian in upstate New York at the turn of the 21st century, a time when the fight against reproductive justice was very strong in that part of the country, I found myself working at a center with children who had PTSD. I was sure at that time I would go to receive a doctorate in psychology and grow up to be a researcher, just like the founder of this center. At least that was until I met CJ. CJ came to the center using rage as a shield for pain. Abused and abandoned by everyone but his grandmother, he was a 10-year-old Black boy caught in the highly developed system of racism in upstate New York. I was the student counselor who facilitated CJ's class. We had group play, behavioral therapy, mentoring, one-to-ones. I was there 3 days a week, and every one of those days, I was in CJ's group. At the end of our first week, he grabbed my phone out of my back pocket and threw it into a toilet. It's a great start. On week 2, he refused to speak or participate. And by week 3, tried to run away when I got off the bus to pick him up from school. It was a long, hard year filled with regular outbursts because of CJ's trauma caused him to assume that nearly everyone was a threat. Slowly, however, using the therapeutic tools we'd been taught, as well as the cognitive behavioral therapy offered by the psychologists, CJ began to open up, to heal even. His cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone measured by spitting in a tube, began to drop. And one day while holding a basketball in the gym, he asked me, "Why did it happen?" And I knew what he meant by the it, beloved. The it in question was years of abuse at the hands of his mother's boyfriend. And the rest of the question was implied. Why did this happen to me? That CJ would even ask was a strange, heartbreaking herald of his healing. We gave regular updates to his grandmother, who would weep when we brought good news. It was the entire point of the center and our work, recreated by a psychologist, a visionary who left a high-profile institution in order to build a center that directly gave back to the community participating in research, instead of keeping it relegated to academic institutions and studies that never gave back. This was not only research, it was a wellness center, a community connection point, a site of healing and transformation. We created feedback loops, community sessions, drop-ins, opportunities to build a safe space. It was about ethical, accountable research. And it was intense. Those early months of building relationships across every imaginable barrier were hard. The kids melted down, and so did the adults. But slowly we found our way to laughter, growth, and even a kind of hope. It wasn't perfect. We were learning together. On the last day of the program, CJ was struggling because saying goodbye was hard for all of us, but especially children who had experienced abandonment. That day, a boy glanced at CJ and he took it as a threat. And so he grabbed a chair and lifted it in the air, about to hit the other boy. I grabbed the back legs of the chair, pulling it to the ground. And that's when CJ released his hold and ran out the door, all the way down to the hall where there were glass exit doors. I found him there kicking as hard as he could against the glass doors, trying to break them open. We were trained in something that is called a bear hug. If a child is doing something that they could get hurt, like putting their foot through a glass door, we were trained how to hug the children without hurting them to keep them from whatever they were doing that might hurt them. I tried several other interventions. None of them worked. And so at last I placed my arms around CJ, crossing my arms in his, and slowly eased our way to the ground. He spat and kicked and cursed and threw his shoes in the air, and then out of nowhere he began to weep. It was a guttural moan that came from soul pain. Years of injury, generational cuts pouring, wailing out onto the floor. After about 5 minutes like this, he began to breathe more slowly, and I released my grip. He put his shoes on, stood up, and walked back to the classroom. It was the end of the day, and it was time to go. He grabbed his backpack and walked toward the door, and I felt nothing but despair. After all he learned and engaged, it was going to end like this. I stood at the threshold of the center's doors, just behind 2 columns. I can still remember this moment, watching him walk down those steps toward his grandmother. She smiled, and I knew the look on her face. She had so much hope for CJ in that moment. And then, to my shock, CJ dropped his backpack in front of her, turned, and ran back to me. He gave me the biggest hug that I've ever gotten to this day. We didn't have to say any words. In that moment, he was hope realized. Hope of generations.
That moment, he was hope realized.
I
Hope of
believed in this.
generations.
And that one question, why did this happen to me? That one question that CJ asked, why did this happen, changed my life forever. I went into ministry because of that question. I started community organizations because of that question, and interfaith coalitions because of that question. I went to jail because of that question, and I'm here today because of that question. My heart and nearly my faith broke when a good friend explained to me years later that that same center who served CJ and other children had become what we call a research factory, driven by the numbers, with no real accountability to the community as it had been created to have. Instead of trying to work closely with families and letting these families know the outcomes of the research they participated in, it now was simply published in an academic journal, used to get more and more funding. Recruitment for the program was done through information in the schools rather than face-to-face with families in the community. There wasn't follow-up or companionship anymore, as it was once a core practice. This, of course, is not the first progressive institution to betray its perfectly worded mission statement, nor the first progressive church, nor the first progressive movement. I've been in churches that simply wanted to count members as a sign of excellence without care for those people's humanity or story, and others that gave lip service to welcome and never dared to reach for actual inclusion. From the pulpit to the nonprofit, I'm sure we each could name organizations whose mission statements seem to have it all together, who have the right banners on the front of the building and the right words on the website, but who are not living into the liberation that they preach. So why are we failing, beloved, in so many of these institutions? If white supremacy had a theology, it would be chattel theology. A set of beliefs that conclude humans have varying worth that can be calculated and altered. Chattel theology dehumanizes and produces planned disruptions in community and the inability to build equitable and authentic human relationship. Chattel, a word meaning cattle, and then capital. Chattel was used to describe the kind of slavery in the United States that turned people into movable property akin to cattle. That property was used to support the building and expansion of free market capitalism. The truth is not just that the white shirt, khaki pant crew have the hold on chattel theology. The truth is, we also have to eradicate it in even progressive institutions today. Now, many of us are taught that theology is only about God, but truth is, theology is everywhere, not just in the church. It is a system of valuing. There is theology in our political systems, in our economics. We, the people, are endowed with certain inalienable rights is as much a political and governing statement as it is a profession of belief. And while we tend to assume theology is always good, as a former hospital chaplain and current congregational minister, I can assure you there is some bad, jacked up theology out there. Theology can be devastating, it can be harmful, it can be dangerous. Dangerous theologies can form our lives around shame and blame, but even more so in systems, theologies can shape the way in which we use resources, who gets to be in and who is out. And more, we don't see the world in terms of theology or meaning-making systems. We use words like culture or governance, perhaps even values. We anesthetize our values. We remove ourselves from theology as a way, I think, to get our conscience free. We create mission statements and perfectly crafted plans, but progressive institutions, particularly ones formed in whiteness, fail. We can work with diversity, equity, and inclusion. We can call leaders who are visionary, liberatory, and who include people of the global majority, and yet the institution will not yield because we have not dealt with the rotten roots. More and more people in my generation grow up without a faith at all. I am among them. And we're rightfully leery of religious traditions and words like theology because Christianity in the US, in particular white-dominated Christianity, has done great harm. But this also means we have a generation that's not used to thinking in terms of theology, of evaluating systems and movements and communities in terms of our values. My people are destroyed by a lack of knowledge. So theology takes hold. It creates systems that accept some people are just necessary sacrifices, that values expediency and efficiency over right relationship and liberation, that says progress is infinite and we too can be infinite. We can be captains. That confuses the role of humans and how much control we have and why we fight the fight. That conflates winning with moral integrity, that says more likes, more public favor, more money signal the assurance of God's favor. It was organizations just like Sister Reach that after Roe v. Wade warned that abortion was a part, but not the totality of reproductive justice. It was leaders just like Cherie Scott who warned that the Hyde Amendment in 1977 was a serious attack on reproductive care by limiting the access to abortion care by class. But you see, chattel theology already had a hold, and as long as abortion was legal, accessibility was not being prioritized. Why? Because chattel theology said some people matter more than others. And chattel theology taught that the poor can be a necessary sacrifice. And chattel theology whispered in the corners of churches and institutions and would-be progressive movements, psst, as long as you can get what you need, that's enough. That this fight was adequately defined by the dominance of one voice, in this case, white women. And chattel theology, while Black and brown women continued to have skyrocketing maternal mortality rates, and while trans and non-binary siblings continue to experience the greatest rates of physical violence, including murder, and while poor teens were pushed further into generational poverty, and our mothers, Black and brown and poor white too, couldn't get the cancer screenings they needed to survive past 60 years old, all the while chattel theology was chanting onward and upward forever, progress is marching. I can't believe what you say because I see what you do, says the prophet James Baldwin. We are where we are because dehumanizing theologies divided us. And some, like me, didn't trust liberation enough. Chattel theology in progressive pulpits and nonprofits is not new. It is not something only of the 21st or 20th centuries. Chattel theology is seen in the contrast between Susan B. Anthony and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. The year is 1866, beloved. Just 1 year after slavery is abolished with the 13th Amendment, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper is an established and well-known name in the American household. A suffragist and an abolitionist, she attends the National Women's Rights Convention in New York. It is the same year that Susan B. Anthony delivers an impassioned speech for the rights of women to vote. But Susan B. Anthony, a white woman, has a sharp disagreement with Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and Frederick Douglass. She believes that the right for women to vote should come before the rights of freed Black men, what becomes embodied in the 15th Amendment. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper argues that the two struggles, freed Black persons and women, are one suffrage movement. And speaking in response to Susan B. Anthony's cry for the rights of women, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper responds on the stage. I feel I am something of a novice upon this platform, born of a race whose inheritance has been outrage and wrong. Most of my life had been spent in battling against those wrongs. But I did not feel as keenly as others that I had these rights in common with other women, which are now demanded. About 2 years ago, I stood within the shadows of my home. A great sorrow had fallen upon my life. My husband had died suddenly, leaving me a widow with 4 children, one my own, the others stepchildren. I tried to keep my children together, but my husband died in debt, and before he had been in his grave just 3 months, the administrator had swept the very milk crocks and wash tubs from my hands. Had I died instead of my husband, how different would have been the result? By this time, he would have had another wife, it is likely, and no administrator would have gone into his house, broken up his home, and sold his bed, and taken away his means of support. She concludes with what I believe is the antidote to chattel theology. We're getting to the hope, so stay with me. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. Years later, a young doctoral student would encounter her words and transform them into what is a well-known quote. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. So how do we overcome chattel theology, beloved? First, we have the hermeneutic, that is the ethics, to wonder, when all you are given is a volume of one voice, to have the courage to raise your hand and say, where's the rest of our history? Where is the rest of our people? Then to have the courage to look at our systems, even our beloved institutions. And as the liberation theologian Young Mo Sung asks, what is this system designed to produce? Who are we leaving out? Rather than dismissing it as a broken system in need of fixing, Sung underscores that any system, whether economic, political, or in this case, a therapeutic one, as in the example of the center, it has to be assessed by what it produces, not what it promises. The product tells you what the system is geared toward. Sung points out, for example, an economy geared to the elimination of poverty would emphasize job creation and better income distribution as central criteria for economic and political decisions, whether on a national or global level. A system that produces something other than its stated use may very well not be broken. It may have been designed, geared to produce something else. What if the stuckness of so many progressive institutions today is because we are producing exactly, sadly, what we were designed to produce? Small progress that does not change the system, and the fights for survival, and acceptance that some must be sacrificed. So to win this fight, we need to move from progressive politeness, from any systems of valuing that say people can be property or ranked in importance, a means to an end, collected like chattel, used for the amassing of power and money, or sacrificed for the rights of some in the face of the wrongs of all. We need to be public theologians, yes, from the pulpit, but also from the way, way back pew. We need to move from theologies that encourage ownership and instead into ones that bring us into belonging, where we say at last, plainly and without hesitation, my liberation is bound up in yours. And so whatever the cost of dismantling, it must be paid from the promise of our shared liberation, our collective birthright, and, beloved, our sacred command. Thank you for letting me share a word or two with you. Thank you, Elder Hannah, for indulging a moment of preaching here. It's good to be with you.
Absolutely. Dr. Tanner, thank you so very much for um, your very, very insightful presentation and very personal presentation. Just a few questions, especially in regards to the word channel or chattel. And what we see here in just a basic definition is saying that a chattel is an enslaved person held by legal property of another. So if you could kind of just take this moment to just kind of help us understand what channel theology is from that perspective and just kind of bring it home just a little bit more for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really any time that you have a theology that is saying the worth of a human being can be calculated.
Mhm.
Anytime you begin to get into saying that there's not inherent worth of every single human being, you're devaluing, right? Someone's humanity. Um,
Absolutely.
and so anytime it's a hard theology to live liberation theology, but liberation theology holds that we all have value. And what's more, God has what's called a preferential option for the poor, meaning the poor hold the margins. The poor are the embodiment, right? And poor not only poor used by liberation theologians is not just about money, right? It's about this idea of who's included, who is seen as holding the power in the midst of empire. So when I talk about chattel theology, sometimes it's really obvious, right? There are people out there we all know that say certain folks don't have value, right? That they don't deserve human rights, which is horrendous and very easy to identify. But there's a lot more subtle examples in which it happens, in which we treat people as if they're worth what they produce,
Mhm.
right? Or they're worth what they can do for us.
Absolutely.
Instead of saying, no, we all have sacred value.
Absolutely. What drew me in was your experience in the education industry.
Yeah.
I'm currently a second grade teacher, so I
Mm.
definitely I definitely have come across um, those challenging, wonderful beings, right? And
Yeah,
what I see oftentimes, even as it relates to as we make the correlation, um, is that sometimes we look at a behavior and we don't take the opportunity to find out the why. There are causes and effects, right? People
that's
don't
right.
just behave a certain way just because there is some a reason for that.
Absolutely.
And so when you talk about value, oftentimes the value, it seems, and maybe you can kind of expound on it a little bit more, but the reason people extract value from said persons is because they're only looking at a behavior. So that behavior I connect to as having no value, but we don't look deeper into the humanity of the person or the individual to find out their why. How important is the why?
The why is everything, right? I mean, so in the God I understand as love embodied, um, the why is where we begin. We never begin with the what of the particular situation. And so I love that question about the why, because the other thing I see is people creating these values and narratives around beloveds, neighbors, community members, and then also projecting story to and explaining all the way around something instead of
Right,
going to the most obvious thing, right?
right,
Like,
absolutely.
why would a young child be so angry?
Right,
Why would we go to there's something inherently bad about that child? Why would that be our go-to if you know anything, and this comes from, unfortunately, people with degrees in education, and you know, that you hear these kinds of things, and it's like, why would that be your go-to when all of our training tells us exactly what you just said?
And the
No
same,
baby's born angry and afraid. That's not how
absolutely,
we come into the world. It's just
absolutely,
not.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the quotes, I believe, I think you said it, let me see it. I can't see what you say, something like this, because I see what you do.
Yeah. James Baldwin. Hmm.
James Baldwin, he comes up, he's got some wonderful words.
Hmm.
If you have a lot of times, our religious community leaders also lend to devaluing in some kind of way, right? In so many different facets.
Absolutely.
If you had an opportunity to speak to our religious community, this is the Preacher Social Justice
Mhm.
series, right? How can we as a community um, be more open, be more biblical, if you will, be more loving, and be what more of the example that Christ, or any faith, most faiths have the
Yeah.
commonality of love. How can we display love more?
So, I was recently at a gathering with a couple folks who don't have housing right now. And they said, what their experience was with a lot of religious leaders is no one looked them in the eye
Mm.
and and said, "How are you doing today?" and listened for the answer. It was like, "Oh, hello, hello," and rushing. So I think love slows down. Um, Love looks in the eye. And as religious leaders, we sign up to be as transformed as we try to be transforming in communities. So I try to come from a position of learning too. I certainly have not always lived up to my hope for liberation and inclusion. But I've tried to be willing to learn and to embody that, right? Like, because love at its core continues to call us into a greater sense of being. But a lot of times, honestly, I think it's like slowing down to really listen to people, um, and and to think about our posture with folks, and like, how is it living in your body? When someone tells you that they're trans, for example, um, like, what's your response? What are the first words you say? How do you demonstrate love in that moment? How do you demonstrate love to someone who's really angry? Maybe not even at you, just because of all the hurt and pain. Can you be present to anger? Because that's certainly what Jesus did again and again, right?
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, no, and I think it gets back to belonging, like I was talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, belonging, and if nothing else, we belong, all of us belong to the human race. So connecting to that humanity,
Right.
um, I think is key, for those of us who are religious leaders. A lot of times we get so enthralled in the theology, or the religious aspect, or our own little, depending on if you're a part of a specific denomination or whatever those principles are, that we
Mm-hmm.
don't connect to people anymore, which
Yeah.
is, very, very, one of our components is harm reduction. And if we
Exactly.
come with the idea, I think, with the idea of reducing as much harm, because that's who Christ is, right? Then we might be able to see some different type of results.
Something I've seen sometimes with my colleagues is also, uh, and I see this in myself, is like, you don't always have to have something to say. Sometimes listening is the most powerful ministry.
Right.
And that goes to the harm reduction too, is like, listening, deep listening is a sacred act. Letting someone tell their story um, is far more powerful than being able to recite, memorize theology or particular scripture.
Right. One of our viewers says, listening to learn and understand versus listening to respond. I thought that was a great key.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Dr. Tanner, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come
To be
share and
with you.
talk with us. Thank you so very much. Would you like to have any closing remarks as we begin to close out for today?
I just want to give thanks again for Sister Reach. I want to do a shout out for any of the members of my community or colleagues who are watching this to please support what I see as ministry of Sister Reach. It's incredible work. The symposium and the gatherings and the teaching, the harm reduction, the services provided, and the advocacy. It matters right now, and the holistic and inclusive way in which you're leading and have been leading is exactly the way to eradicate the kind of chattel theology I've talked about, right? Like everyone in, everyone in. And that gives me great hope. And so I just want to say thank you. And for anyone watching, particularly folks maybe who don't think of themselves as directly impacted by reproductive justice, help with the lift here. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if there's an offering taken up this evening, but you get your checks out, get your online donations out, and double that amount you might have given, because what's being given by Sister Reach is life-saving.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Tanner, for joining us, and rich blessings to you and love. And we'll talk some more.
Yeah,
Have a great evening.
that sounds good, Elder Hannah. Take care.
All right. Bye bye.